Hello and welcome back to Answering Bart Ehrman. And today we're going to finish chapter one. Finish chapter one. And we're going to be looking at really a surprising thing that he writes, and that is his main reason for leaving the faith and what his reason wasn't and what his real reason was. And so it's going to be a very interesting episode. So make sure you stick around for the whole thing. So Matthew, can you get us going on page 16 for us, please?
Yep, thanks, Sam. Page 16, he says, at about the time I started to doubt that God had inspired the words of the Bible, I began to be influenced by Bible courses taught from a historical, critical perspective. I started seeing discrepancies in the text. I saw that some of the books of the Bible were at odds with one another. I became convinced by the arguments that some of the books were not written by the authors for whom they were named. And I began to see that many of the traditional Christian doctrines that I had long held to be beyond question, such as the doctrines of the divinity of Christ and of the Trinity, were not present in the earliest traditions of the New Testament, but had developed over time and had moved away from the original teachings of Jesus and his apostles.
Okay.
We'll leave it there for now, yep.
So we've got four reasons there,
Yep.
Four of the historical, critical reasons that he gives.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he doesn't spend any time really on those.
No.
And so we'll just make some brief comments now because he's really just setting something up for what he's going to say later on. So, just a few brief points. What do you want to say about the discrepancies that that have changed his mind?
Well, we've had a chapter of alleged discrepancies that we've gone systematically examined and found very unconvincing. So he'll have to provide some discrepancies that are of substance, I think. We haven't seen that yet.
So he hasn't given any yet. So he said, we've got all these discrepancies, but we've looked at all of them in previous episodes and they're not there. He talks about how the books are at odds with each other.
Yeah,
at odds with each other. Well, yeah. We've looked at some of that already, but there's going to be more of that in later chapters. And, we haven't seen any evidence for that yet. It's the same with the authorship issue. People say that, the authors are not who who Christians claim the authors of the New Testament documents are. And I believe that's going to be coming up in later chapters. So, we'll look at that. And I guess what I want to say there is that we've got answers to these things, and Christians have written great responses that we'll be looking at later on.
They're good. They're good questions to raise, aren't they? But we're contending that there are good answers to those good questions. That's the difference.
Yeah. He then says that Christianity developed over time, and that the original teaching of Jesus wasn't that he was God and in the Trinity, but that these ideas have come, later on. And so he's trying to pull apart the New Testament and look at, which part was written first. And then from this, he wants to say that, the earliest parts that we know come from Jesus didn't have him in certain ways. Now, again, this is something we're going to have to spend more time on in the future, and we will. We might even put a whole episode just on how you can date the New Testament and the different sources within it. But you said you knew a great book on this subject. What was that book?
Oh, well, I'm just recalling because Bart Ehrman, 5 years after this one was published a book called How Jesus Became God. But giving his argument basically that over time, Jesus started out just as a Galilean peasant, and gradually Christians developed the idea that he was actually God Almighty. There was a great response book by a bunch of New Testament scholars called How God Became Jesus, which I think is a great title because it's something the New Testament says and presents over and over again, which really just was a very strong critique of Ehrman's book, laying out he hadn't really made his case. And in fact, throughout the New Testament, it shows that Jesus is God and portrays him that way. One of the real sticking points, I think, for people with this, just briefly, is there's a difference between the substance of the idea that Jesus is God, or the substance of the idea of the Trinity developing over time, versus terminology developing over time. It's one thing to say over time Christians developed a vocabulary for describing in a very technical and precise way that the persons of the Trinity, the three divine persons are God, the Holy Trinity. That's another thing to say that the substance of those ideas isn't in the New Testament, because when it comes down to it, they're just trying to summarize the Bible in a more pithy and straightforward kind of manner. When you look at the Bible, you see the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, each are portrayed as God, and that there's one God. And you just piece these things together and come up with a summary of that, and you arrive at the doctrine of the Trinity. So we just don't want to. So you need to distinguish those two things, which I don't think he's doing. We would say the substance of the divinity of Christ is insisted in the New Testament over and over and over again. And if you think that the Bible is reliable in what it says, then it's pretty clear that you have to arrive at the doctrine of the Trinity if you join the puzzle pieces together, if you like.
Sure. And look, I think it'd be worthwhile doing an episode where we explore the order of the different sources and where they say what.
Sure.
And, we might do that as a special episode later on.
Yeah, but anyway, there are expressions of. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say there's expressions of Jesus' divinity that are very clear in the earliest books of the New Testament. Or as you well know in the work you've done, Sam. But yeah.
So for instance, Mark's Gospel, which is a source for Luke and a source for Luke and Matthew, and is used and quoted by Paul in different ways. So we can date it very, very early. It begins with Mark quoting Isaiah 40 and Malachi 3, which are both references to God coming to his people, and that's how he introduces Jesus. So even if we take Mark, which is recognized as one of the earliest, the earliest gospel, it begins in its opening verses with Jesus is God coming to us. But look, I think we should explore that in greater detail later on.
Yeah, great.
Because really, he doesn't spend much time on that. And what he moves on to say is, he's given this overview of the historical problems that he's got, contradictions and authorship, and and he just gives the summary. But he then really moves on, and I'll read this on page 17. He says, "There came a time when I left the faith. This was not because of what I learned through historical criticism." So he's just been giving all these historical critical points, and now he goes, "I didn't leave the faith because of them, but because I could no longer reconcile my faith in God with the state of the world that I saw all around me. This is the issue I deal with in my book, God's Problem, how the Bible fails to answer our most important question, why we suffer. There is so much senseless pain and misery in the world that I came to find it impossible to believe that there is a good and loving God who is in control, despite my knowing all of the standard rejoinders that people give." So here we now come to a very important part of the book where he's saying he didn't give up his faith because of the historical critical method. In fact, I'll just read this little bit at the end of the next paragraph. He says, "I decidedly do not think that historical criticism necessarily leads to a loss of faith." So he's very clear there. He's saying it's the problem of evil and how to account for evil and suffering in this world.
So he's again introduced another big idea that he doesn't kind of go on about. I mean, it's a very important question. It's a question that a lot of people, ourselves included in various ways, face either experientially or intellectually and so on. Again, I think the Bible does give a lot of good answers to it, or at least sufficient answers to this question. We're called to trust in God through difficulty. But he doesn't give a full picture of kind of the reasons for it, does he, Sam, in this bit? I know you were struck by that. There's no mention of sin. There's no mention of being under God's judgment. There's no mention of Christ returning to restore all things. These are some of the core ideas the Bible gives to understand suffering through that sort of narrative.
No, you're right. Because now, first of all, if anyone's suffering out there, we're not trying to make light of this. We all suffer in different ways. I suffer, like we all suffer. We can't get away from it. So I'm not trying to make light of it. But he puts forward, the standard argument of a good and loving God who controls all things, right? So good and loving, all in control. How can there be suffering? Now, the problem with that argument that he gives is that that's not the whole picture. He's only including certain points. If you add into that discussion, if you add other points like humans have rebelled against God, humans are in a sinful rebellion against God and are under God's judgment, well, that changes the argument a bit, doesn't it? Right? It's where God has handed us over to our own behavior so that we suffer the consequences of our own behavior. There's more to it than that, but you've got to include that in the argument. You also want to include that God has come and in Christ shared in our suffering. So God's not remote from all this. He actually understands it all and has shared in it. And we've also got the promise that this is not just how the world's that this is not how the world was made, and this is not how the world will always be, that God has a plan to bring about restoration and peace and healing. And so he invites us to share in that plan of resurrection and healing to the world. So, I can see it's a problem for him, but I want to say that if you're going to represent what the Bible says, don't just say God's good and God's in control, because it says a lot more. And, you got to say the whole story to get the whole picture. That's all, to see whether or not it's reasonable or not.
Yeah, and it's a very different framework than what the Bible gives, and it leads to a very, again, not making light of people suffering, but it leads to a very selfish place, because it makes it sound like we expect that God's job is to guarantee our pleasant lifestyle. God's in control of everything, and he should make sure I have a good life, therefore. And it becomes a very self-centered way of looking at the world very quickly, I think. Whereas if we start looking at that bigger picture of God's plans for all things, which are very, very generous to us, there's a great deal of mercy in God's dealings with us, in sending his son to die for us, and he's coming again to bring us into his kingdom. But that's about God's plan, and it's not just about guaranteeing the lifestyle I want in the here and now. It's a very different shape to how we approach the question at that point.
Yeah. Okay. Now, can you please read for us the last paragraph? Page 17, the last paragraph. We'll finish off with this. Where, again, he makes some interesting points here.
Yeah, he says, all of my closest friends and next to closest friends are in the Guild of New Testament Studies, who they agree with most of my historical views of the New Testament, the historical Jesus, the development of the Christian faith, and other similar issues. We may disagree on this point or that. In fact, we do. We are, after all, scholars, but we all agree on the historical methods and the basic conclusions they lead to. All of these friends, however, have remained committed Christians.
Okay.
Some teach at universities, some in seminaries and divinity schools. Some are ordained ministers, most are active in their churches. Historical critical approaches to the Bible came to many of them as a shock in seminary, but their faith has withstood the shock. In my case, historical criticism led me to question my faith, not just its superficial aspects, but its very heart. Yet it was the problem of suffering, not historical approach to the Bible, that led me to agnosticism.
Okay. Well, when I hear that, I find it interesting that he's straight away saying that all of his academic friends didn't take the same path as him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think he must be overstating things when he says that they all agree on the historical methods and the basic conclusions they lead to. I think if his friends have remained committed Christians of an orthodox type, then they will have found all kinds of shortcomings with some of those methods that have led to very skeptical conclusions, because believing that the Bible is essentially true in what it asserts is foundational to faith. I think we'd have to say. I think Ehrman would say. So and especially those who are ordained ministers and the rest. I mean, yeah, you have to be able to trust that the Bible presents God truthfully and speaks about the truth of the gospel. It teaches these things, and we can trust what God says in the Bible.
Yeah. But it is interesting that he says that they've all remained Christian and they're all teaching, and they don't have a problem in the same way that I do with the historical critical approach. And so it seems to me that what he's wanting to do here is to say that my problem is the type of faith that Christians can have where they don't take history into account. So that's his problem here, that there's the type of and I'm stereotyping it here, but that blind belief.
Yep.
And he's saying, that's what I'm against. I want people to consider the historical critical approach, which we would agree with.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
Right. I mean, I've got no problem with it. As I said, I think it's actually fascinating and helps us to understand Jesus and the whole Christian movement better. So I've got no problem with it. As he says with his colleagues, they've stayed Christians. So, all of these issues he's raising,
At the very last second in the chapter, all of this stuff wasn't the reason I didn't become a Christian. It was actually the suffering thing. It's a very unexpected turn, isn't it? And they're both very important issues to engage. And obviously this series will engage more of the historical stuff, because that's more what this book's about. There are good answers to all of those things, we believe.
Yeah. Anyway, so some very interesting sections there in the end of that chapter. Now we're going to be heading into chapter 2 next week, which is a whole lot of different contradictions that he gives. This is sort of teasing out one of the points that we brought up at the beginning of the video, where he says that the different books teach different things. And so in chapter 2, he's going to be exploring that more. And so make sure you come back next week as we begin with chapter 2, and I'll see you then, Matthew.
Thanks, Sam.